This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with Paul Byrne, author and co-founder of the Tamarack Institute in Canada. Paul is the child of war refugees from Ukraine, and he grew up as part of a Mennonite community in Canada. Living a frugal, simple life, working on a farm, having a spell in a seminary, forming a theatre group, and working with life-term prisoners led him on a path to solving deep community challenges with the organisation that he founded. Community is mutual acts of caring happening often. Let's hear from Paul. Paul Byrne, huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you keeping?
Lovely, and thank you so much.
You were so welcome, and obviously we're not chatting to each other in person. We're doing it over the airwaves. But I also have the benefit of seeing right into your room. There's a bunch of objects there that look really, really unusual. So my first question is, where the hell are you? And my second question is, could you describe some of those unusual items I see behind you?
Okay, well, Greg, what a pleasure to be here. And I'm in Waterloo, Canada, which is just about an hour and a half away from Toronto. So everybody knows Toronto, Canada. Waterloo is a 2-university town. We're very agricultural as well, and we've become the Silicon Valley of Canada. So it's kind of a privileged place to live. It's lovely.
Fantastic.
It is winter here, though, which makes it a little less lovely. I think you guys sometimes think that your weather sucks, but come live in Waterloo and you think you'd be living in paradise.
It was so nice. ABBA decided to write a song about where you're living.
Oh, I think that was a different Waterloo, but I get it. In my office, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I have 5 singing bowls. They are bowls that...
That's cool.
They keep me calm, and I don't know, I love the idea of vibration. And maybe we can talk about the role of vibration in community change. And then I don't know, like I have a bunch of Buddhas in here, particularly the happy Buddha, who looks a bit like me. So if you ever want to know kind of what I look like, go and find a happy Buddha. I smile a lot. I have a pot belly, and I think the happy Buddha is kind of like a summary for me. And I'm not a Buddhist per se, but I am kind of, and I'm also a Mennonite, and it's kind of a mainstream Christian denomination. But they often nickname me the Menno Bood. So I'm kind of this Mennonite Buddhist in my upbringing and thinking. Kind of important for me because we were, as a Mennonite people, we came to Canada. My people came in around 1950 after the war, and we had experienced some pretty horrible things in the Ukraine, including both of my grandfathers being executed. So it's kind of a cultural awareness, and it's shaped a lot of how I think about the world.
Yeah. So what age were you, Paul, when you touched down in Canada?
Yeah, I was a dot in their imagination. I had not been born yet. Like I was born in 1962.
Yeah.
So 12 years after they arrived. But the community of refugees was our church, and we were very cloistered. That was our life. And it took our community about 25 years to heal, more like 25 years before
You were the child of a very wounded community, weren't you?
Very wounded, and the first one to kind of leave and go off to school.
Can you tell me about your mom and your dad?
Yeah, Mom had a grade 3 education, and she gave me the love of language. So even though she had a grade 3 education, she taught herself to read, and she would make up words. She had very little respect for the English language and would make up all her own words. And like we'd get lost somewhere driving around, and she said, "Ah, what a rumgeriesel." Like what a great word for getting lost, a rumgeriesel. We had kind of a Germanic background, and well, it was lovely. She couldn't write, so every Sunday she had almost a photographic memory, and every Sunday she'd sit all the kids down with all these cards that she was going to give out to different people on Sunday, and we would have to write out these cards to people for her. And I remember that as such a sweet, sweet memory now. Then, of course, I resented it that every Sunday I had to write these cards out. And then she would go and hand them out to people. That was Mom. Dad was a hardworking farmer, built up a beautiful farm in Canada, and worked at home on the farm. Yeah, it was really, really quite lovely.
Did you enjoy the farm work?
Loved it. Yeah, I loved it. I still think of myself as a farmer, and I love to garden, have a big garden, and love animals.
I think, Paul, there's a difference with people, and this is something that really surprises me on the Win Happy podcast, and it's one of the reasons I ask people where they came from and what they did and what their parents did, and I think it shapes you so much. And what I've noticed is that anyone who comes from the land, they seem to be earthed. I know that's a very kind of corny thing to say, but there's something running a little bit deeper, and a deeper appreciation and a bit more stability, maybe. I'm not sure. But there seems to be, they're just more grounded. I'm thinking of some of the characters that we've worked with. Like, for example, where we live now in Cork City, we've had colleagues who may have come from West Cork, which is close to the sea, obviously on the land. And they're just earthed. There's another layer, there's another dimension going on. Does living in a farm give you that?
Well, I think if you have happy memories, it does. I mean, there are people who run from the farm and they're angry at the farm, and I've always seen it as a huge part of my identity. And that and being a refugee, coming from a refugee community, those two really define me. And then I think, if you know anything about Mennonites, we're kind of like Amish. Have you heard of Amish before? So that's kind of our lineage, and it's a unique combo, right? Because you can living close to the earth is a way of life, and I think being our faith community was a way of life that resonated or that was easier to live in a rural kind of setting. And then as refugees, we needed a long time to heal. And so being near the land was very healing. So there was all those factors. I am in love with farming and farm life, and I find myself spending as much time as possible in the country. Yeah. We have a little cabin in the country, and I'm there all the time and have a huge, like I said, a garden. And I don't know. It really makes me calm. It helps me to be calm and, like you say, grounded.
Yeah, and you have that in abundance, and that smile and that warmth, absolutely. Leaving one country out of pure necessity and coming to another country, were you and that community, were you accepted in Canada?
Well, it's interesting. I remember walking down the road and, one experience in particular, there were many, but where someone rolled down their window and just yelled out of their window, "Go home, you fucking Mennonite." Sorry for the language.
You say,
that's what they said.
Thank you very much for the warm greeting.
Yeah, and I mean, we were different in some ways. We showered once a week, and we worked in the barns, so we kind of smelled. We dressed differently, very, very simply. We didn't have much money, and we hung out together in a way. So, we didn't make it easy for people to accept us.
Yeah.
It took a while. I think now, it took us about 25 years before we had assimilated, and people like people that are like them. And so by then we were very much like everybody else around us and lived quite the same, But it's hard to be an immigrant, a refugee family, especially when you don't force yourself to assimilate quickly. We certainly didn't. I remember even our church, we spoke German until I was like 10 years old. So I grew up, I went to school with my first language being German, not English.
You're absolutely right. I'll accept you as being like me if you start behaving like me, and we get along fine.
Well, and it goes back and forth. I mean, the interesting thing is that we got along far better with the people from the Punjab of India, we have the largest migration of people from Punjab, India. All my neighbors were Punjabi, So I grew up eating cabbage rolls from the Ukraine and chicken curry or dal with our neighbors. So it was this kind of really weird mix, but we really identified with each other.
Yeah, well, you were both different, so that's something you had in common.
Yeah.
And as a young man growing up, did you want to be like everyone else? Did you want to fit in, or were you happy being the outsider?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. It's a great question. I didn't have any longings. I was just always kind of happy, and I wanted to. Every immigrant's dream. I wanted to get out of poverty, and worked really hard, and I had this weird kind of passion for the African American struggle. Weird only in the sense that I was kind of cloistered from everything, but I was in love with MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. Like I was just in love with him. And even at one point, I remember telling my dad, and I think he was horrified. I said, Dad, I think I am a black man in white skin. I don't know if I'm not think that's politically correct to say, not today, but I mean, it was an indicator of this weirdness in me where I had this strong identity with him. And I think it had a lot to do with his drive and the beauty of the civil rights movement in America. Yeah, I think if anyone pulled me away from farming and into the world of social change, it was all those people in civil rights movement, all of those involved with MLK, Martin Luther King, and I had this sense of justice and sort of working for human rights.
And Paul, you mentioned the word poverty. It was one of the first things you said. Were you very poor, were you?
We didn't know we were. Mom was a marvelous baker, but I think the only thing we bought was sugar and flour. That was it. We grew everything else ourselves. I remember once my dad bought our farm, there was lots of housing being built up around it, and our dog would always go wandering out and neighbors would get mad. So my dad bought a dog chain so that, when we weren't around, we could have him on this long dog chain. And I remember there were some people from the congregation, our church, who had felt that we were being very extravagant, that we would spend money on a dog chain. So I don't know if that's the definition of poor, right? I'm sure it was worth I think it probably cost us a couple of dollars. But that only lasted until my early teens, and the farm did really well, and a lot of people were moving into our area, and so my dad bought some land and developed it. And by the end, it's kind of like the quintessential immigrant story,
Yeah. So that career path in your head, Paul, I know you said you wanted to pull away from poverty. What was the grand plan? That young Paul Byrne, yeah.
Yeah, when I was 16, we were the chicken capital of Canada in Abbotsford, British Columbia, where I grew up. And there was lots of egg farms, including our own. And the chickens needed to be moved. And I had been doing those from one barn to the other. And I had been doing that for a long time, since I was 6 or 7 years old. So when I turned 16 and got my driver's license, I put a canopy on the back of our pickup truck, and then drove around and picked up my friends and then went to job sites and got contracts from farmers to move their birds. And at one point, I had 82 workers on my roster. And I still joke I was making a lot more money back then than I even am now. And so my true desire was to become a millionaire by 21. And I think I've done that several times for our organization, but I've never done it for myself in that sense. And when I turned about 18, we were doing well as a family. And I told my dad I wanted to go to seminary. I went to seminary. I started studying liberation theology, a lot of the works of Gustavo Gutierrez. And that was very formative for me, but I couldn't do it. I don't know what it was. I felt like this wasn't a good career path for me. I kind of had this love affair with sin. And I just knew I wasn't going to break it too quickly. So I didn't think this was going to be a good career path. I got in trouble a lot and came back home and took on a job at community services. They had 3 businesses that they were running and they were all bankrupt. And they asked if I would come in and kind of turn them around. That was my foray into human services, turning around 3 not-for-profit businesses to make them profitable and more humane for people. And that was my start. And from there, I learned a lot about community change and had some great mentors.
And you had nothing really like that in your background, had you, before that? Other than living in that community that looked after each other?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, I had no framework. When I was running my chicken catching company, I was like the golden boy of the community. And when I went into seminary and human services, I was the black sheep. It took about 4 years to go from one to the other.
Yeah. Did you learn anything from that time in the seminary, did you?
Yeah, I mean, liberation theology is a justice-based theology that kind of talks about God's preference for the poor. And it sort of looks particularly at the life of Jesus, and that Jesus hung out with a lot of people that were outcast and poor and broken. And so many of these theologians are in Central America working in oppressive regimes. And so they write about this, and that in order for true justice to occur, our care for the poor is the definition of us living a good life, a right life.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was very influential. It is to this day. I still find myself going back to Gustavo Gutierrez's works and writing and the like. Our latest pope comes broadly from that mindset.
You pretty much know he did come from that mindset. He's a good pope, isn't he?
I like him.
Yeah. He wrote a book during COVID. I have the book. It's funny, actually. My mother popped in one day and she had it. And you know how thrifty they are, because Mum is 86 now. So even though Ireland wasn't in World War II or anything, but all the rationing and everything else would have affected us. So thrift was just part of their lives. So she arrived in, right, with a borrowed book from my aunt. Of course, they put a cover on the book just to make sure that the cover didn't get a bit too battered by handing it from one person. So I just told her, listen, it looked like an interesting book. I'd order it myself and I'd order a second copy for her. I thought it was a wonderful book with a huge spotlight on the world we're in and COVID and everything else. It's a pity he can't open up even more about some of those things and be a bigger spokesperson around it, because he has that depth of character, I think, to carry it. But of course, the church has been blemished itself in so many ways.
I think what he does is maybe telling for our time. It's when they are able to bring context to our actions rather than telling us to do certain things, right? I think when people have kind of lost sight, they make rules. Do this, do that. When they are like him as a leader, they say, this is how one should live. This is kind of what your heart should be. This is what you should care about. They work more from a principles perspective rather than a rules perspective. And then allow you to figure out what a good life is and how you're going to make a contribution. And I think, all religion has this tension between good people being good and people doing what they're told to do. There's kind of that, difference. And I think when you find leaders that talk in broader terms and trust people can find their way within them and then live by example, as he does so beautifully, it's quite precious.
Yeah. And of course, it's an organization with a hierarchy and power and everything that goes with it. And we know what happens then. So, Paul, the guy who came out of seminary with this farming background, when did you found your change rhythm? Because for you're the change maker, and I'd say you're the peacemaker. When did you find your groove?
I was still a lay minister, and I preached a sermon. No other foundation can any man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. I still remember the scripture passage. And then I looked at the congregation and I said, and this congregation is built on quicksand. So you could tell how the sermon would go downhill from there. Well, the elders banned me from the pulpit for a year. So here I am, 21 years old, and I got banned from the pulpit.
Why did you say that?
In Abbotsford, British Columbia, in church. I was a lay minister, so lay ministers preach in our tradition.
But I mean, why did you say that?
Because our congregation had been a congregation that cared about the downcast and the poor, and now we had just built $1 million church, and we were in an upscale neighborhood, and we were recruiting upscale people to come to church so that we could pay off our building.
Okay.
And I was not the only one saying this. There was a kind of a youth lay ministry there, and we were all critiquing the church for what they were doing. What happened shortly after that, I went and lived with a group of people. Have you ever heard of L'Arche?
Yeah.
Jean Vanier and the L'Arche movement. It wasn't a L'Arche community, but it was modeled on that. And I went and lived there for 2 years in a little cabin in the woods, but on the property where they had a home. And there I found my healing. And then a huge spurt of energy. I developed a drop-in center, which eventually had about 120 people with developmental disabilities would come to every Friday for entertainment and just they were lonely. Then for some reason, I was appointed to the prison to be the youth representative to our maximum security prison. And somehow the warden took a shine to me and asked me if I would be the liaison to the lifers. These are all the people who were in prison for life for horrible crimes that they had committed. And somehow the lifers convinced me to start a program called the CONCAP Olympics. And we used to bring 35 people with developmental disabilities into the prison and team them up 1-on-1 with a lifer. And we would play these games. Like a typical game would be like a 3-legged race where they had to do it together.
Was there any moment, Paul, during all of that when you said to yourself, how in the name of God did I end up here?
I agree, because I had a warden's pass. That means with a warden's pass, I could go into the prison 24/7 without protection. And I still to this day, I'm thinking I'd be scared shitless if I had to do that now, But somehow, and I was on 11 committees at the time, and I had a job that was really flourishing in that area, and I was learning. And then I had a very wealthy uncle who said, Paul, it's time that you quit all this nonsense and you come and work with me and potentially take over my company. So I left it all and I went to go work at his company, and I lasted 1 summer and quit, and then ended up in hospital for a week with a bleeding ulcer. And I share that because that was quite seminal. And a church leader that I had met in seminary, he was actually a professor at the University of Waterloo, phoned me up and said, "You come and study with me. You need a break from all of this." Had this very intense time, and got involved in. I always had a love for theater, and I started my own theater troupe and went through university with that, and really kind of grew in confidence through all that. And then ended up starting the Community Opportunities Development Association economic development group that worked with the poor, but on a developmental level. And that's where I had shared with you these stories of Ireland. That's where that all started to happen. But we grew the organization to about 85 staff working in 4 cities. And we were really the foremost group working with those living in poverty. Matter of fact, the United Nations declared us one of the 40 best practices in the world.
And did someone give you a guidebook? This is how you do this stuff? Or was that, okay, we need to experiment, we need to innovate, we need to figure this damn thing out?
Yeah, well, I think the wisest words that were ever shared with me were by a man by the name of Miles Kavanagh, Father Miles Kavanagh, in a place called Brookfield in Belfast, who said, "We listened and we gained a corner on the obvious." And that so resonated with me because that was my style.
Yeah.
I never stayed in my office. I would go where the needs were and I would just hang out. And I had staff in all the low income neighborhoods rather than in our office. So it was like always being on the ground and somehow looking for what obviously needed to be done. We were able to make breakthroughs that were quite unique. We helped 1,200 people start companies. 85% lasted over 5 years, and all of them were on the dole. All of them were on welfare or unemployment when they started their businesses. So it was an unprecedented record, and we had our own bank, and we had our own business action centers, and we had our own buying clubs, and we had another team that would go, and whenever a plant closure would go down, a plant would close, and we had a lot of those back then with free trade, and we had a 98% placement rate. We would go in with a hit team, and we would just have an amazing approach, but it was all human-centered, where the workers became the people who found jobs for other workers. We created right away a sense of community and a whole process in which the people who were in need were the givers. So they were giving and receiving. And I think that's probably for me the greatest wisdom, is just this sense that community is mutual acts of caring happening often. But it's not about giving. It's about giving and receiving. And it's this reciprocal action. You can see me rolling my hands.
Yeah.
It's this reciprocal action that creates an energy. The energy of life is in receiving and giving. And when that happens in a group of people, in a sense of, it creates community, and it creates this bond, and it changes the way we think about how things need to be changed. And I honestly didn't hire a lot of social workers.
Okay.
Who thought about helping people, who were trained to help people. I hired a lot of people right from the communities themselves who had been in need, trained them to be the giver and to teach this reciprocal cycle of giving and receiving.
Paul, you've written 4 books, and I know you're on the process of finishing your 5th. Your last book was Deepening Community.
Right.
Is that literally the playbook for everything that you're talking about?
Kind of. I mean, it's deepening community, finding joy together in chaotic times. So maybe it's a bit prophetic.
Welcome 2022.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, Greg, because my first really popular book was called Community Conversations.
Yeah.
And it laid out a methodology for larger scale change and for ways that communities could work together and take ownership of their future. Deepening community went upstream, which basically said, if we lose our sense of connection, then we will lose our sense of a willingness to give. We will isolate ourselves. And when we isolate ourselves, citizenship is what dies. Our sense of giving back, our sense of being a giver, and we become obsessed with receiving. What can the government do for me? What can my neighbor do for me? My neighbor is making noise this morning. That's making me mad. Instead of saying, oh, my neighbor's cutting down a tree because if it doesn't, it's going to fall on his house. Can I go over there and help him or her? You know, you know what I mean? It's You don't get upset when you're there cutting down the tree with them. But when you're sitting in your backyard, zipping a coffee, and your neighbor's cutting down the tree who you don't even know, that becomes annoying. You know what I mean? And it's the whole world starts to fall apart when this reciprocal relationship breaks down.
Trying to follow the thread of those two books, Paul, is the first one all about having the seed that allows change happen in communities, and deepening community. Is that really saying that if you don't have that seed, you're in big trouble?
Sort of. I think so. I mean, I should have written deepening community first, but I only wrote it second because I didn't think of it first.
Fair enough.
I just always assumed that people would take care of each other.
Yeah.
You know, and I know of all the stories where that has broken down, but I never realized how deep that was. Again, my definition of community is mutual acts of caring happening often. So Greg gives and Greg receives, and it's a reciprocal relationship with your friends and your family and your community.
Yeah.
And it's a way of being. It's a way of being in the world. And there's kind of an expectation that if you get a flat tire, someone's going to stop and help you, even if it's just holding the umbrella while it's raining. Or if you see someone with a flat tire, you're going to stop and help them. That simple act is fundamental in terms of cohesiveness. But then the next level, which is my first book, talks about how do we get 100 people, 1,000 people, 100,000 people to work together? How do we come up with a common agenda for the kind of place that we want, the kind of relationships that we want? And how do we all chip in? And in some ways, how do we make this reciprocal, these mutual acts of caring happen often in our community? When we lose our sense of community, going back again to the second book, when we lose our sense of community, we lose our sense of wanting to give, and we become even suspect of those who want to help. That to me is the breakdown of absolutely everything.
What's that process, Paul? How do you get that back? And maybe we might talk about Northern Ireland just as a reference point for the listener as to how you can, start implementing that positive change in places that are horribly divided.
Yeah. Well, again, I feel like I grew up in Northern Ireland, only that I was maybe 5 years into CODA at the time, this organization I was running. And someone from Northern Ireland approached us and asked if we would do reconciliation training, where they would bring kids from the IRA and the UFF to Canada, and we would house them with Irish people living here and some Scottish, and we would get them to like each other. We had this wonderful methodology for having them hang out with each other and for finding the right families in which they had these wonderful experiences. And we grew to bringing in over 200 young people a year who were having these experiences, and we would So when they went back to Ireland, they couldn't hate each other. Not even just who they were, but they had an experience of of reconciliation, of loving. And they had friends now who were Protestant or Catholic. And that's how it started to break down. And then there was this sense of, what does it mean to live a meaningful life? Like, what does it mean to live that? How does one live a meaningful life? And that's, again, where one has a sense of community that is reciprocal, but that also is not exclusionary, because what you'll find in deepening community, I do talk about what I call fear-based community. So you're taught as a I don't really like it wasn't just about Protestant and Catholic. That was far too easy. It was much more about the IRA and the UFF. And so you're taught a kind of a way of looking at the other, othering people, and that they are, in a sense, not human. And so community is not as simple as giving and receiving. It's also welcoming everyone. And I don't know if I'm making any sense. In a sense, it's like we become, the act of receiving is a vulnerable act. Even though, some people call me the expert in this, but every time I go through it, I kind of go, the only expert is, every situation is so different, because when you apply it in that context, it's very simple, actually, because it's just really bringing young people who are Protestant and Catholic and getting them to love each other.
Yeah.
And you love each other by giving and receiving. You build a sense of community. So then when you have that love in your heart, you go back to your community and you can't hate anymore. I guess you still can, but it's a lot harder to hate. And so there you go. There's so many other contexts like that where we can change that relationship. It's like when in our work, we always bring together in dialogue people with lived experience. So if you're living in poverty, that's you. Business leaders, government leaders, and human service leaders. And we bring them together in dialogue. And so then the business leader and the person living in poverty leader are in dialogue with each other and get to know each other and hear each other's story, have fun together, learn to take care of each other. We give those experiences in everything we do. And then we get them to work together for a better world. That's the 4-prong formula that I came up with. Have know each other's story, right? Have fun together, because there's all this theory of fun and change, and why that's so important around peace building. Learn to care for one another, so create situations where that giving and receiving happens, and then the magic formula: get people to work together on behalf of someone else. Collective altruism, we call it.
And that simple process that you're describing, and it really is simple and beautiful. You're the co-founder of the Tamarack Institute and the co-CEO. Are they really the building blocks of the Tamarack Institute and the
Absolutely.
Thinking and everything, the guiding principles?
Absolutely. Yeah. They're the guiding principles. We have all kinds of theoretical words for all of this that the field likes. We have 40,000 active learners. And we have formal partnerships in over 400 cities of people who use our methodologies to advance their work and thinking, whether it's reducing poverty or addressing climate change or building youth futures or even deepening community. We have learning communities, formal learning communities in 400 cities that develop broad-based community plans and to create a kind of a city that gets really serious about deepening community, or gets really serious about ending poverty. And it's been really effective. Our poverty work has been going for 20 years now. using these simple ideas. And when we started, there was not one city in Canada with a poverty strategy. Now there is nearly 400. We had not one province or territory with a strategy. Now they all have one. And the federal government actively discouraged us from having for advocating for a national strategy. And now we have one. And pre-COVID, we achieved the lowest level of poverty in the history of Canada. And we just broke 10% now. So we're at the point now. The working poor is our next big challenge. 42% of everyone living in poverty is working, and we think that will be eliminated within the next 3 to 5 years. There's all the policies in place. We just have to put them in place now, and then we'll institute the guaranteed basic income for the rest of the population, because it's not economic poverty for at least 5% of our population. It's really health poverty. They're having health problems, not full-fledged disabilities, but they can't make a living in this economy. And so, if everything goes as planned, our movement is at the center. There's lots of people in the movement, but we're at the center, and we're going to end poverty by 2030.
I hope you can join me on part 2 to get Paul's unique perspective on COVID, the world around us, and what's in store for the future. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.